We are very excited to have today with us at our Hazak program, Jesse Gabriel. The topic, I made up the title of today's presentation, What's a Nice Jewish Boy Doing This For? Jesse Gabriel was first elected to the California State Assembly in June of 2018. He represents the 45th Assembly District, which includes San Fernando Valley. He currently serves on 5 standing committees. He was recently elected by his colleagues as chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus, which I've never heard about before, so hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that today. In 2019, he was considered one of the 100 leaders across the state recognized as California influencers by the Sacramento Bee. In his first full term, Gabriel authored 9 bills that were signed into law by the governor, including the highly regarded measures to expand access to justice and protect communities at risk of hate-motivated violence. Before getting to the legislature, Gabriel worked as a constitutional rights and general litigation attorney, where he helped resolve complex disputes and even represented clients before the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2018, he was honored with the California Lawyer Attorney of the Year Award by the Daily Journal. He's a committed environmentalist and longtime community activist. Jesse Gabriel previously served as a Los Angeles County Commissioner and as a board member of the LA League of Conservative Voters and the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. He lives right here in Encino with his wife and 3 sons, a graduate of UC Berkeley and Harvard Law School, and is a member of Valley Beth Shalom. And Jesse, we're very excited to welcome you and want to have a conversation with you. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And what I've asked people is if they have comments or questions to type them in the chat room or raise their hands, which will hold until after your sort of remarks. And I'll be moderating that conversation. So Jesse, thank you very much for joining us.
Joel, thank you so much for having me. Good morning, everybody. Boker Tov. It's nice to see you all. I am coming to you this morning from Sacramento. So the legislature is in session today, and normally I would fly up on Monday mornings, but I flew up last night so that I could be here and have a conversation with you, and I'm looking forward to it. Joel, I'm going to correct one thing you said about my bio. I served on the board of the League of Conservation Voters, which is very different than the League of Conservative Voters. So they're just to ground us for where
my bad.
That's okay. That's okay. I just wanted to get that right. But also, as Joel mentioned, really proud to be a VBS member. Feel exceptionally lucky to be part of the community. As Joel mentioned, we have 3 little kids, 6, 4, and almost 2. Our 4-year-old is Joshua's at the ECC and loving every minute of it. And our younger guy Noah is about to start there probably this summer for camp, and then next year for school. So we feel very connected to the shul, and we actually go back a little bit. My father and Rabbi Ed, as we know him, were actually roommates in Israel in college in 1973. My dad was a student at Berkeley. Coincidentally, that's where he met my mom. They were both studying abroad in Israel in 1973, and Rabbi Feinstein was on that trip as well. And as for those of you that know history, that was the year of the Yom Kippur War. And so that class was there for the Yom Kippur War and became incredibly bonded as they lived through that very, very traumatic event in Israel's history. And my dad actually traveled around Europe with Ed afterwards. So I know all kinds of stories about the rabbi from when he was in college, some of which fit with his public image these days, and some of which are a little different. But we just love the synagogue, and actually have a family relationship with Rabbi Shulweiss before then. So really, really good to be with all of you and see you all. Joel, with your permission, I would love to turn this into a conversation and just answer questions and talk about whatever is on your mind or other people's mind. Maybe if it's okay, I'll just give a few minutes of introduction about the legislature and the Jewish Caucus, and then whatever people want to talk about, I'm happy to do that. So as Joel was mentioned, I was elected in 2018. It was actually a special election to replace the seat for a member of the legislature who had to resign in scandal. I represent about 500,000 people in the San Fernando Valley. So basically my current district is, if you live anywhere west of the 405 Encino out to Calabasas, Agora Hills area, then I work for you. And I'm one of 80 members of the state assembly. And so about 8 months a year, my schedule is on Monday mornings. I get on an airplane and fly up to Sacramento. I'm here through Thursday when the legislature is in session. And then on Thursday, I fly back home. We have a very, very active legislature in the state of California. Somewhat different, I would say, than some of the dysfunction in Washington these days. So one statistic I always like to share with people is I like to ask them to guess how many votes I take in a 2-year session. So I don't know, Joel, you want to guess? You're on mute.
I would guess 80.
80 votes. So I take 6,000 votes in a 2-year session as a member of the legislature. Yeah, I just saw Diane's face as the reaction was exactly right. So there's a lot going on up here. Unsurprisingly, there's a Democratic supermajority in the state of California. So the assembly that I serve in is about 75% Democratic. Now that is not, doesn't tell you everything you need to know, because a Democrat from say Santa Monica and a Democrat from Modesto are very, very different. And have very, very different priorities and ideas and interests, and particularly on maybe environmental issues or other things, can vote very differently. So we have a very democratic legislature, but we still have all kinds of regional and ideological debates. I've found it to be a really interesting place to be. It's also been a really complicated time to be in public service. I did not have once in a century global health pandemic on my bingo card when I ran for office. So, I realized that I've been in office now with much more time dealing with the pandemic than before, and that's been very challenging. And I'm happy to talk about that as well. But it's also been an incredibly rewarding experience. If you think about it, the state government is actually making most of the laws under our federal system of government that impact people's daily lives. So education, higher education, criminal justice, the environment, regulating the world's 5th largest economy, elections, all of these things are things that we work on up here in the legislature. Also, just wanted to give you a little brief overview of the Jewish Caucus, and I can talk more about it if Joel's interested. We actually have a very active and robust Jewish caucus that is relatively new. So for many years, the legislature had what they call ethnic caucuses or identity caucuses. And so there was always a Black caucus, a Latino caucus, a women's caucus, an Asian caucus, more recently an LGBTQ caucus. And a few years ago, they decided to organize a Jewish caucus. The Jewish membership in the legislature was relatively low. But over the past couple of years, we have actually become one of the largest caucuses in the legislature. And we are 18 of 120 members of the legislature are members of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus. I find that kind of auspicious that, we have 18 members. It seems to work pretty nice. We got to jump immediately to 36, I guess, is our only option. But it's an interesting group, and it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that we're the only caucus in the legislature that has what we call affiliate members. So not all 18 of our members, so 13 of the members of the Jewish caucus are folks who are raised Jewish and who identify as Jewish and who are practicing Jews. The other 5 are people who have what we would describe as a strong personal or familial connection to the Jewish community, who came to us and said, we would like to be part of the caucus. So one of my colleagues, Jose Medina, married a Jewish woman. They have a daughter who's Jewish. She's modern Orthodox. He feels very connected to the Jewish community, and so he's part of the Jewish caucus. Interestingly, we actually have 2 sisters, one who serves in the state assembly with me, the other in the state senate, who found out later in life, their names are Blanca and Susan Rubio, that they were the descendants of conversos. And they found this out through some genetic testing that they took. And it all started to make sense. They realized they had these family traditions that, they would light candles every Friday night. There was no explanation for it. It was just something that their mother had done and taught them to do. In the winter, they played a little game with a spinning top. So they realized as they started to put it back that there were all of these things that, all of these signs that they were the descendants of conversos, and then the DNA evidence spoke for itself. So they are actually very active members of our caucus. Neither of them were raised Jewish, but they really do feel connected, and I think actually both of them are planning to come to Israel with us this summer. So in terms of what the Jewish Caucus does, we do two main things. One is that we work on what we consider to be consensus Jewish communities priorities. So these would be things like anti-Semitism, hate crimes, community security, Holocaust education, things that are core to our community's interests as Jews, and to be a really proud and outspoken voice for our community on those types of issues. And the second is, for the last couple of years, we have developed what we call our Tikkun Olam agenda. So we pick a couple of bills that aren't just about our community or only about our community, things that we think speak to our values as Jews, the mission that we have to help repair the world and to be partners in creating a better world for our kids, and have often tried to do those things in partnership with the other caucuses, with the Black Caucus, with the Latino Caucus. So these might be things like foster youths or homelessness or student hunger, things that we feel really as Jews, we have a responsibility to work on, and have also worked on things related to immigration. So it's really fun and interesting to be building up the Jewish Caucus. We've actually sort of become a little bit of a force here in Sacramento. We're trying to increase our footprint. So I'm happy to talk about that as well. So Joel, I'm going to stop filibustering now and turn it over. But anything folks want to talk about, I'm happy to chat about.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Candace to unmute and ask your question.
What are we doing? What concrete steps are we actually doing to address the water crisis? Desalinization. I mean, we hear all the talk and their bills and their this and that. What steps are more likely in play right now?
It's a fantastic question, Candace, and I'll tell you, I would have a much better ability to tell you that in about 3 or 4 weeks. So we're at a point in the legislative process at the very beginning when everybody is just starting to introduce bills. There's just starting to be conversations. I've been a part of a number of conversations about this, and we're working on some legislation both around water recycling. I think there's some really interesting opportunities there, and actually working with some companies that have done work in Israel, because Israel does an amazing job on this issue on conservation. And then also looking at some incentives for people to be more efficient with the way that they use their water, both through water metering and also through thinking about landscaping and irrigation and other things like that. But all of these conversations are sort of happening right now. And I think in the next 3 to 4 weeks, we'll have a really good sense of what the main bills out there that folks are going to be working on. I know, and this is probably true for every question you ask me. We're just at a very initial stage in the legislative process. But here's what I will tell you, Candace. This is top of mind for folks, even though we have had a wet, we had some big storms come through that everybody lived through and were helpful. We understand that this is a ongoing and very, very significant challenge for the state, and is going to be one, and that we need to do some both immediate thinking about it and also some long range planning. And part of what this is actually getting into is, I just want to take a step back here, a much larger conversation about climate change. Because, and I had this conversation with my father the other day. He said, I feel like we used to talk about climate change and it was something that was out in the future. And he said, I feel like it's here now. And it is here now. And we are having very significant conversations about what we would call climate resiliency, both on the water and the drought front, on the extreme heat. I mean, some of you remember it was 121 degrees in Woodland Hills last summer, the highest temperature ever recorded in LA County. We're going to have issues with extreme heat, with wildfires. If there's debate in Washington about whether or not climate change is real. If you go talk to LA County fire captains or LA City fire captains, they will tell you that the fire seasons that we are having that are now going from a period of the year to lengthening, that is all climate change. And the modeling that I've looked at from some of our UC professors is really shocking. And then the other thing is sea level rise, right, for our coastal communities. So we're trying to have a conversation about our water problems, and I suspect, Candace, and we can update you on this in a few weeks about what the really big bills are that are going to move through this year. But this is also part of a larger conversation about climate, and we need to try to stop climate change and think about how we work on our emissions and all of those issues, which are a big conversation. But no matter what we do, even if we were to take some really significant steps right now, we have to be thinking about climate resiliency, because we are going to feel in very, very significant ways wildfires, extreme heat, drought, sea level rise. All of these things are happening, and we're actually trying to build that into all of the conversations that we have about a lot of public policy issues. And it's a really a good friend of mine in the Jewish Caucus recently became chair of one of our environmental committees, and I went out to lunch with her the other day. And I said, "How are you doing?" And she said, "Not well." And I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "I'm just part of my chairmanship, just meeting with all of these experts and talking about climate change every day." And she said, "It's really depressing. We have extremely significant challenges ahead of us. And, we're trying to be on the forefront of those in California, but we can't do everything alone." And so that's why some of this national and international action is so important. But we will, Candace, I will have my staff follow up with you when we have a good sense of what the biggest bills are going to be.
So Jesse, what got you interested in politics or running for office in the first place?
I blame my parents and my grandparents. I grew up in a family that was very focused on politics and international relations. So I was born in the US, but when I was 4 months old, my family moved to Israel. And I spent the first couple of years of my life living in Israel. And then we moved to Washington, D.C. My dad is now a professor at UCLA. His first job was as a professor at Ben Gurion University in the Negev Desert. And then his second job after that was at the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington, D.C. And so I spent my early years, I think, with this very real awareness of, maybe the world. And I think those years living in D.C. as a little kid were pretty formative. But it was also just a family that talked a lot about politics around the Shabbat dinner table. Right. And maybe not necessarily politics, but world events and international relations. And, my parents and grandparents were active in a lot of things. My parents were very active in the Soviet Jewry movement. And so took me with them to rallies and marches. We're always the chairs of, various social action committees at whatever synagogue that we were part of. My grandparents were very much activists as well. And I think, from a young age, I sort of, grew up in this ethos that we had a responsibility to try to make the world a better place. And that, the best thing you could do with your life was to help people, and that the goal wasn't to get rich and make a lot of money. It was to try to see how you could really make a difference with your time on the planet. And I think that was, so from a very, very young age, I was interested in this. Running for office was, I won't say it was an accident, but it came about a little bit in an unexpected way. I had gone to undergrad at Berkeley, spent some time working on a political campaign, presidential campaign in Arizona and New Mexico, went to law school. And when I graduated, I worked for 2 years in the United States Senate as an advisor to former Senator Evan Bayh. Some of you may be familiar with him or with his father, Birch Bayh. And it was just an awesome experience. I mean, it was just the coolest thing. And, I'm a Democrat, and I was there at a time when it was the beginning of the Obama administration, and the Democrats had control of both houses of both the Senate and Congress, and a lot of big things were done. And I got to work on 2 Supreme Court nominations and in the Recovery Act, after the Great Recession, and the Ron sanctions legislation. It was just such a cool experience. But my wife, who I had met when we were students in Israel, and who's a little younger than me, was getting ready to take the bar exam, and she was threatening to take the Maryland bar exam. And I knew if she did that, we would live in Washington, D.C. forever. So I convinced her to take the California bar exam, and I moved out to LA and was practicing law. And we started a family, and everything was going really, really well. And then very candidly, we had this change in administration in 2018, right, where we had a presidential election, and I got to be very concerned about the direction of the country, and had been involved always sort of just not professionally, but in various causes and environmental causes. Did a lot of pro bono litigation, was doing some work suing the Trump administration on behalf of DACA recipients. As some of you may remember, the administration had tried to end the DACA program. These are these young people that brought to the United States as children, and were promised that if they, came forward and sort of if they came forward and registered, that they could continue to work and live and study in the United States. And then the program was abruptly canceled on them. And, was really feeling the distress of the moment, like our country had gotten off track. And like I was really not sure about where our country was heading, and not sure about the kind of world that we were going to leave behind for my kids. For those of you that are parents, you start to think about the world a little bit of a different way when you become a parent. And my wife was pregnant with our second kid. And so this seat opened up in the legislature representing our community. I'd never run for office before. I never, had no experience. But some people in the community actually reached out to me and said, "We think you ought to think about this." And my initial reaction was, "That's crazy." At that time, I think my son was 8 weeks old when my middle son, Joshua, was 8 weeks old when I started running for office. I said, "This is crazy. Like, this is totally the wrong time to do this." And I went and talked to my wife, and she said, "Well, why don't you go talk to some people and see what they have to say?" Right. This is, just think about it a little bit. So I went and spoke with Zev Yaroslavsky and Mel Levine and some of the people in our community who had served in office. And the message I got from all of them was no. These opportunities come around very infrequently, and we need more young people to get involved in politics. We need new voices. This is an important moment for our country, and you ought to really think about this. And, so I talked to some other folks and decided, I'll throw my hat in the ring. I had no idea. I thought my campaign was going to be over in 3 weeks, and I was going to embarrass myself, and I was going to sort of, crawl back to my law firm with a little egg on my face. But it just sort of started to spiral, and we ended up pretty decisively winning our primary. And so that was that was a really interesting experience. And I can talk more about what campaigns are like if people are interested. But really, Joel, I think it was the combination of the influence of my parents and my grandparents, and also just really feeling, as I still do, that in a lot of ways our country's off track, and our politics are off track. And I'm not as optimistic about our political system as I used to be. But for me, that's a reason to be involved, right? It's not a reason to walk away. It's a reason to get more involved and to try to change things and maybe point things in a little bit of a better direction.
What a great story. Yeah, I mean, it's hard waking up every day, reading the news and trying to remain optimistic. So Sandy Berman has a comment or question. You want to unmute?
Okay, I had two questions. Is the caucus satisfied with the ethnic studies program that has been passed by the legislature? Because for a while it was not good for Jewish people, but I think they've improved it. What does he think about that? And also, the other question was, there's certain foods, and they say like almonds that need lots of water. Are there any restrictions to people who are growing certain things that are take an awful lot of water? And I don't think people who are drinking almond milk realize this. So that's my two questions.
Two very good questions, Sandy. So I'll take the ethnic studies one first. So I think, I guess let me get a sense, how many people have been following this somewhat? If you want to raise your hand, just so I know sort of where to, okay, I'll start kind of at the beginning. So before I was elected to the legislature, a bill was passed and signed into law requiring the Department of Education to create a model curriculum in ethnic studies. This is the idea that our history has often not included voices from underrepresented and marginalized communities, and that when I was a little kid, you read Island of the Blue Dolphin and you made a mission out of sugar cubes, and you didn't really get the full story on what actually happened to the indigenous population in the state of California, right? It wasn't all rainbows and sunshine, to put it mildly. So the Department of Education contracted with some folks to create a curriculum, and the first curriculum that came out, I mean, Sandy is, wasn't good for the Jews. I think it's like the most mild way you could say that. It was really, really problematic. It had some very, very problematic and geographically and historically inaccurate anti-Israel stuff weaved into it. And you have to ask yourself, why are we talking about Israel in a class that's supposed to be about the experiences of, ethnic populations in the United States? And then it had in it what I would just consider some straight up old school anti-Semitism. Right. I mean, descriptions of Jews. I mean, read this poetry that sort of alludes that Jews are behind the scenes manipulating the media. I mean, really scary and problematic stuff. And so our caucus took the lead in we issued a scathing condemnation of it, and got the process sort of stopped, and the governor apologized for it, and a bunch of people apologized for it. And they ended up sort of redoing the committee that was doing the curriculum, and we ended up in a much better place with the model curriculum produced by the state. And now not only has no anti-Jewish stuff in it, actually has two lesson plans about the American Jewish community, because we felt that it was important for young people not just to learn about the experiences of Black students and Latino students and Asian students, but also to learn about Jews. We're an important group in the state of California. We're an important part of the fabric of the state. And so we got some really good material in there. And by the way, not just about, the story of Jews immigrating from Europe, but also lesson plans about Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews. And, you look at our community of VBS, right? And our significant Persian Jewish community and our significant Mizrahi Jewish community. So making sure that they were reflected in the curriculum as well. So if the question is about the model curriculum put out by the state, I'd say we all feel really good about it. And one of the indications that we won that fight is that the original group of super extreme folks who put out the really problematic version of the curriculum said, we want nothing to do with this, right? This isn't what we want. The more complicated question is, we have also passed a state law saying that ethnic studies is a high school graduation requirement in the state of California. And schools can, but are not required to use the model curriculum. And so there's now a renewed effort by some of these folks who, and by the way, they have really extreme views on Jews. They also have really extreme views on a bunch of other things, right? I mean, it was, you had people on the left who had huge problems with what they produced, not just because of the way it talked about our community, but just because of some of what it taught. I mean, it really is the kind of stuff that will, I would worry would just like foment ethnic conflict in our schools, right? I mean, it's written with a really hard edge to it. So they're now trying to go school district by school district, pushing sort of their, they call it liberated ethnic studies, right? I would, call it bigoted ethnic studies or racist ethnic studies. And so there's a whole conversation about how do we point school districts in the right direction. And one of the things that we did in the caucus was put amendments onto the bill, making it a high school graduation requirement that made it very clear what you can't teach, that you can't teach ethnic studies in a way that discriminates against Jews, that discriminates against Israeli Americans, or really that discriminates against anybody, right? That's not appropriate. That's not appropriate to have in the classroom. So we did well by the model curriculum. We have really strong, we call them guardrails in the bill, but it's an ongoing challenge and something that I'm in conversation probably on a weekly basis, with folks around the state, trying to help them make sure that their school district is going in the right direction. Now, by the way, LAUSDs has been teaching ethnic studies since 2014. The reason you've never heard of it is because it's fine, right? It's a curriculum that people feel good about, that people from all different backgrounds feel good about. And so there hasn't been, the controversy around it. So San Francisco, believe it, has an ethnic studies curriculum that they've been teaching for a while that everybody felt good about. So I'm firmly of the belief that you can teach ethnic studies, which is important in a pluralistic, multi-ethnic democracy like California, in a way that doesn't promote anti-Semitism. I really believe those two things are possible. And so that's the direction that we're pushing. The food question is an excellent one. And you brought up almonds, which are a great example. The other example I give is a hamburger. Do you know how many thousands of gallons of water go into a hamburger? There are conversations about all of this. It is a very complicated issue up here politically, because as you know, California produces our great Central Valley produces a huge amount of food for the United States. It's a very important industry for the state. I did not realize when I got involved how complicated water politics might be in the legislature, but it's a real issue. What I will say on it, what I'm most intrigued by, and I was literally having a conversation this weekend, so I think you heard me mention, I'm hoping to I will take a delegation of my colleagues to Israel this summer on a legislative delegation. Some of you may have heard about some of these startups that have come out of the Technion in Israel, where they are actually growing meat from cells. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. It's fascinating, and you should Google and read about it. And one of the interesting things is that they may actually be able to grow kosher pork. That is at least what I've been told halachically, is that there may be kosher pork when my kids are, old enough to go out to restaurants by themselves. But that holds tremendous environmental promise, right? If you can actually, create meat in a laboratory through a scientific process that tastes good, that doesn't involve, water. Believe it or not, people sort of laugh, but cows are actually a huge contributor to methane emissions. Cow farts are actually a really serious environmental problem. People don't realize that, but it's true. And then also all of the ethical issues around how we treat livestock, right? And all those issues, which I think are important ones. So was literally having conversations this weekend about trying to set up a visit for our delegation to go to the Technion in Haifa and meet with some of the people who are behind that and explore that, because I think that could have some tremendous promise for me, mostly on the environmental front. But one day you may eat a pepperoni pizza at VBS and it's going to be kosher. So we'll see about that.
Jean, are you still there? You had your hand up, or you were unmuted for a while. Did you have a comment or question? Need to unmute.
No, I didn't have my hand up. I probably was just gesturing to my husband.
No, Jean. Okay, so Eileen, you unmuted. Did you have a comment or question?
No. So.
Oh, okay, I'll mute you again. Okay, go ahead, Jean.
Okay, it's my turn.
Yes.
Jesse, Democrats have been known, according to everybody, to spend all the money they can get. Our budget seems to have lots of money, and I'm wondering if there's any consideration on give back to the people, whether it's reduction in gas tax or something of that sort. As everybody's aware, between the taxes and the cost of living, a give back of some sort would really go over well.
Yeah, it's a great question. So a couple of things, just to set the stage for everybody. So our budget last year in the state of California was about $260 billion. So we have an enormous state budget. California alone is the world's 5th largest economy, right? So we have an economy larger than most countries. We actually, I just was part of introducing a bill to try to have California get involved in sanctions on Ukraine. And we have an economy in California that's many times larger than the economy of Russia, just to give you a context for what we're doing. Last year, for a variety of reasons, we had very significant revenues, as was mentioned. One is a lot of money that we got from Washington, D.C. For COVID recovery. And the second was because our revenue is largely based on capital gains taxes. And so actually, when you have tech companies that IPO or you have a good year for the stock market, the state budget does very well. So the question is, what should we do with our surplus? And it looks like we're on track to have another very significant surplus. So I'm part of a group up here that thinks, yes, we need to be there's some really urgent needs out there, and homelessness and other things and climate change that we need to make very significant investments on. But I've also wanted us to be mindful about putting money away for a rainy day, because we have really bad boom and bust budget cycles here in the state, right? And so one year you can have amazing revenues, and the next year you can really drop down. And I actually got a lecture about this from our city attorney, Mike Fior, when I first was elected. He said the worst day he ever had in politics was when he was a member of the legislature and they had a conversation about would they approve cuts that they knew would kill people. So we're required by law to balance our budget. It's not like Washington where they can deficit spend. We have to balance our budget every year. And they had found themselves in a big hole without enough reserves, and they needed to cut spending. And so they knew if you cut spending on assistance for kidney dialysis for poor people, I mean, what's the outcome? You're going to kill them, right? I mean, that is the inevitable outcome of doing that. And yet you're required by law to balance your budget. So I have wanted us to be mindful as we have had these significant reserves about not every year is going to look like this. And we need to be putting money away because inevitably things are going to change. Now, the other question then becomes is, should we give money back to the voters? So I think we're going to this year for a couple of reasons. One, because of inflation. Right. And all of you are seeing, I just went and, put half a tank of gas in my car yesterday and it was $60. I mean, it's just crazy. And people, people out there who are, a lot of folks, particularly in the Valley, who are sort of living paycheck to paycheck, are just being crushed by this inflation right now. The other reason, frankly, we're going to do it is because we're required to. So some of you remember Prop 13 probably, right? So right around the time Prop 13 was passed, there was another thing passed called the GAN limit. I'll admit, I actually wasn't familiar with it when I came to the legislature. And it requires that if the revenue hits a certain point, we're actually required by law to give money back to the voters. We can either, the exceptions are putting money into education or putting money into infrastructure. And so there's or reserves. So there's very kind of complicated questions about, some of you have been following at the federal level. We're arguing for all about what counts as infrastructure. So there's some complicated conversations in Sacramento. But in his State of the State speech yesterday, last week, the governor basically said, we're going to, particularly given the, inflation and gas price and everything else, we're going to give money back. And I think that's right. And, part of this is that we're going to require to do some of it by law. But you would be shocked, and I'll speak for myself. I mean, I'm very lucky to be in a position where we don't live paycheck to paycheck and we have a little bit of comfort and breathing room. But, you drive a couple miles away from VBS and there are communities where, 90% of the families live below the poverty line, where a lot of kids, go to school so they can eat in addition to getting an education. And people are just being crushed by some of these by some of this inflation. And so I think putting money back in the pockets of people is something that we're going to talk about in a very serious way up here this year.
Thank you. So Jesse, what would you most like to accomplish?
Wow, that's a complicated one. That's a real complicated one. I mean, there are a couple of policy areas that we have carved out that are really important to me. And, there's some really big things on both the climate front and really on the homelessness front. I mean, I asked to be on the housing committee when I got elected. It's sort of, hard to think that you alone can change this issue because it's so complicated and really has mostly been the city and the county. But I just, every day when I, drive around the Valley and see what's going on and even see it up here in Sacramento, it just feels like we failed so badly. And it's just shameful. And so making some real progress on that, it's challenging. I will tell you the politics of it are extremely challenging. There's no policy agreement. It almost doesn't have to do. It's not that Republicans and Democrats are fighting over what to do. There's just not policy consensus on what the solutions are. I have some pretty well articulated thoughts on things that I think we could be doing better. So if I could be part of making a real difference on that issue, I'd feel really good. But that's a hard one, right? Because it's not the state that is taking the lead on it. It's the city and the county. And so I'm part of a group of people up here who are saying we need to be more aggressive, right? The city and the county are not getting the job done. I do not have very many conversations in the Valley where folks tell me, hey, you guys are doing a great job on homelessness. Keep it up. So I think we have a mandate to get more involved and make a difference there. And you know, the other thing that actually I'd really like to do in my time in office is build up the capacity of the Jewish community to participate in the process up here in a more significant and meaningful way. And I think the Jewish Caucus is a big part of that. There's an expression, and I'm not super fond of it, but it has some truth to it in politics, that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. There's a lot, not everybody pays attention to what's going on in Sacramento, and our community traditionally hasn't been that focused on it. And I think we woke up recently and realized through ethnic studies and some other things that it's actually really important that the community have a voice, both to protect ourselves and then also to advance policy that is consistent with our values. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is just build up the infrastructure, the caucus and some of the outside political things so that the Jewish community can have a seat at the table, and really be involved in the policy process in a meaningful way. And I'll tell you, somebody asked me, Joel, about a year into my time in office, they said, what is it that surprised, what are some of the things that surprised you most, right? Now you've peeked behind the curtain and, you're part of it. What surprised you most? And one of the answers I gave was how little most of my colleagues know about Jews. Not about the Middle East, not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I drop my kids off at VBS and then I drive down Ventura past Mitzvah Land and I go have lunch at Tel Aviv Grill. And you live in Encino, you could think that the entire world knows about the Jewish community. Turns out that most of the state doesn't look like that. And I have very large numbers of folks who I've met working in politics who have shockingly little knowledge about our community. Did not grow up. They don't represent Jewish populations. They did not have Jewish friends growing up. They don't really know about Jews. I mean, one of the most eye-opening things to me, we were in session over Pesach, my first year in the legislature, and I brought up matzah with me, and it was just, nobody knew what matzah was. And these are people who are highly educated, who'd gone to, good schools and good universities and didn't why is Gabriel walking around with these big crackers? What is he eating for lunch today? And it made me realize that, we have a lot of work to do to educate people about, why is it that our community reacts to certain things? Why are we so sensitive to the notion that young people would be taught that Jews are behind the scenes controlling and manipulating the media? Well, let me teach you a little bit about Jewish history, right? And about why that pushes buttons in our community. And so just teaching people about our hopes and our fears and our aspirations is important to me. And then also really working hard to build bridges. I mean, we've done some awesome things with the Latino caucus jointly, with the Black caucus. I'm hoping to take a bunch of those folks to Israel this summer, in part to teach them about Israel, but in part to try to build relationships, because I think there's some really beautiful things that our communities can do when we're working together. And I will tell you, it's really cool to watch as some of my colleagues learn more about our community and they discover, wow, this is a really incredible and vibrant community that we share values in common with and we should be working with. There's that is actually a big priority for me. And then the third thing, if I can, be a little, I don't know what the right word is, hopeful about my ability to leave an impact. The other big thing I'm working on is trying to really make a difference on this issue of social media and the way that it has just spread disinformation throughout our society and created severe political polarization and led people to believe things that are fundamentally not true. I don't know about, all of you, but I feel like when I was a kid, Republicans and Democrats didn't hate each other. Right. I mean, we had people that lived on the same, you had a difference about, you had a disagreement about the role of government in the economy or whatever it may be. But, people were not at each other's throats in the way that they are today. And just, some of the misinformation about, everything that happened at the Capitol on January 6th, about, COVID, about public health, about all of these things. I mean, there's some really big challenges out there, I think, with the way that social media is influencing our public debate and the way people think about the world. And it's a very, very complicated issue, but I chair the privacy committee, which has jurisdiction over the internet and social media and all of that. And so I'm working on some really big bills in that area this year. I'm working with the ADL on a big bill on online hate. The amount of anti-Semitism and racism and homophobia that is triggered online is just unbelievable. And so I'm, in a little fight with the tech companies right now, and it's either going to go really well or they're going to end my political career. But either way, it feels to me like one of the biggest issues facing our world right now is how do we get our arms around social media and do so in a thoughtful way? Because I think that the impact on mental health, on political polarization, on misinformation is really significant.
Absolutely. On that last one, I mean, we're observing even how misinformation and disinformation is being used by Russia to propagate their agenda. I mean, and then we look at ourselves and, we have to believe that same thing is happening here.
100%.
So we're a senior group, as you know, Jesse. So any issues affecting our community, elderly, seniors that you're involved in or want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, y'all look pretty young to me.
Thank you.
The word has different meaning to me now that my parents, who I still think of as young, fall into that category. A couple of things. I mean, we've tried to do some work around prescription drugs and prescription drug pricing. Also some work around prescription drug labeling. Shockingly high number of hospitalizations and deaths every year from people getting confused about their medications. So that's an area where we've worked on stuff that's relevant to seniors. I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of the things that we're working on, the way I look at it is I try to take a step back and say, what are the biggest issues impacting everybody in my community, right? So homelessness, climate change, mental health, whatever the issues may be, and try to go after those issues. So, not less, I guess I would say less specifically for seniors, although I think probably a lot of things that people care about.
Norm, you had a comment or question?
It's a question. The question is that since a heavy percentage of the gas price is state taxes, can't we do something on an interim basis so that these people who are living paycheck to paycheck can afford gas by reducing, at least on a temporary basis, the gas tax?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, what we're trying to think about is doing it in a way that frankly, that the oil companies just don't keep prices where they are and fill the vacuum, right? So if we roll back the state gas tax and they think that there's a possibility to just increase the prices and the price stays the same and they capture all the money, we haven't helped anybody. We've just made oil companies richer, right? And that's not what we're trying to do. Those aren't the people we're trying to help. So part of what we're thinking about is there a different way, potentially actually just sending money back to people, putting it in their pockets, which then they can use on whether it's gas or food or, because we're seeing inflation across the board. So those are some of the conversations we're having right now, because we know that people need relief and we need to send money back. The question is, how do we do it in a way that actually helps people? And that's the conversation we're having right now.
So as you mentioned, there seems to be a lot of polarity in national politics, at least, and a lot of changes happening in many other states to change voting rules and, sort of contribute to this polarity. How is that affecting you and California, and what can be done about that?
It's a great question. I mean, so first of all, California has sort of become a national model in ensuring access to the ballot. And, I don't want to be super partisan here, but I think what's going on in some of these other states about trying to limit access to voting is just shameful. It's just absolutely shameful. And, you know, my view on this is trying to prevent people from voting who are lawfully and should be able to vote is just reprehensible. And so in California, we've sort of gone in the opposite direction, which is trying to make it easier for people to cast a ballot, right? And not throw up artificial barriers, you know, and all this stuff. You can't give water to people who are standing in line, or, you know, you need 17 forms of ID to count. I mean, you know, it's very intentionally meant to shape who votes and who doesn't, to benefit a certain political party. And I think we ought to have a competition of ideas, and whoever wins the most votes, you know, that's democracy, right? You know, let the people have a say. And, you know, I think, frankly, I'm a Democrat. I think, you know, come November, it ain't going to be super pretty, is my guess, for Democrats. But that's, you know, the people have a right to have their say and to decide. You know, that's the fundamental tenet of democracy. We have moved very hard in the other direction. We now, I mean, you are all probably used to now getting my guess is most of you get your ballots at home delivered to you. You know, that will become permanent. And I really like that. I love being able to do it from, you know, my wife and I sit down and we open our ballot and we take out our laptops, and believe it or not, even I don't know who all these judges are. So we try to do our research and figure out who's who and who deserves our vote. And, you know, I bring my boys and we sit and we have a conversation about what we're doing and why we're doing this, and, you know, get to point out my name, which is pretty cool. So I like that. And I like the direction that California is going in. And in some ways, you know, I was doing some thinking with folks on the national level about this. California has really become a model for other states that are trying to expand, you know, access to voting and access to the franchise. And so that's, you know, that's a pretty important priority for us. But it's complicated, as you noted, because, you know, we only had the ability to control what's going on in California, and, you know, we're not a swing state, right? So that's where the real action is.
Gil, you had a comment or question?
Yes, I wanted to ask specifically about mental health hospitals, particularly with regard to homelessness, being involved back with a psychiatric hospital that I was, and now since have sort of eliminated, or at least made mental hospitals a minimum, and that we're not able to take care of depending upon who believes, whether it's 30 to 60% of the homeless people are mentally ill. And I understand it's a complicated issue because of drugs and alcohol and multiple factors, but we do not have hospitals like we used to, where you could put somebody in for evaluation for a couple of weeks. And what is the plan, if there is any, for mental health hospitals?
It's a great question, Gilbert. I apologize. You were going in and out a little bit, but I think I caught most of what you said. And it was about the role of mental health in addressing the issue of homelessness. It's a really, really important point. And I think, as you noted, there's actually some dispute about what percentage of those experiencing homelessness are dealing with mental health issues. And it's a really important question to answer, right? Because if somebody is homeless because they have, you know, had an unexpected medical emergency and had to pay a medical bill and went into a financial tailspin, they need very different intervention than if somebody has severe mental illness, right? Now, the other reason that folks can often be unhoused is because they have a substance use disorder, right? They're addicted to drugs or alcohol. Interestingly, that's often people self-medicating for a mental health issue. And my sense of this, as I've looked at the data, is that there's actually, we're sort of dramatically underreporting the number of folks experiencing homelessness that are dealing with mental health issues. And it was very interesting. Some of you may have seen this. They did the homeless count a few years ago, and they came out with the statistics on what they thought, you know, the number of people were, you know, mental illness was a significant, you know, contributing factor. And the LA Times actually went back and audited some of that and came up with a much bigger number, right? a much bigger number in terms of the mental health issue. But to your point, I mean, it's interesting. USC and UCLA will give you very different numbers based on their research. So I believe very firmly that mental health care has to be part of the solution, and it has to be a significant part of the way that we address this. The debate up here has really been about, and some of you may have seen this, the governor recently announced a proposal, what he's calling care courts, around what do we do with those folks on the street who are unable to take care of themselves, and what do we do about getting them healthcare, right? And the I take a view here that is maybe a little bit different than some of the civil liberties advocates, which is that I think it's fundamentally non-compassionate to leave somebody on the street who clearly has no ability to take care of themselves, and is just going to, I mean, in some ways it's a death sentence, right, for some of these folks, right, if they're who are unable. And so I think that, you know, requiring people to get some mental health care, putting them into a facility, helping them to turn their life around is actually a really important part of the solution here. So I am a big advocate for doing a lot more on this front. There's a lot of conversations about that in Sacramento right now, but it is complicated both by, there are constitutional limitations in terms of involuntary commitment, and then there's, you know, political conversations that need to happen. But to me, that has been an area where we have not put enough emphasis and not put enough resources. And I think we need both more dollars and better policy on the mental health front.
With that, Jesse, I want to thank you. I know you got to get going. Do you want to just quickly say something about the volunteer weekend?
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me. That was wonderful. Hopefully Jenny on my staff reminded you to do that. So Sunday, April 3rd, we are holding what we are calling our West Valley Day of Service. It's basically a mitzvah day with a different name. And the idea being here, you know, there's a lot of need right now in the community. There's a lot of people that are looking to get out and do something good. And I was sort of in a funk a few weeks ago, and I've always found that the best way to get out of a funk is actually to do something nice for somebody else, right? The best way to change things. And I think that there's a lot of folks who are eager to do that. So we're organizing it Sunday, April 3rd. Everybody will meet at Pierce College in the morning for some breakfast and for some energy, some pump up. And then we're going to be doing volunteer activities all over the San Fernando Valley, half of which will be on site at Pierce College and half of which will be elsewhere. Activities for people of all ages and all mobility levels. You can write thank you notes to healthcare workers. You can pack outreach kits for those experiencing homelessness. You can go paint a mural at an elementary school in Reseda, fix up a trail in Tarzana, help pack supplies for domestic violence survivors. There'll be all kinds of, we have about 30 community partners. VBS is an official partner for the event, and we would love to have all of you join us. Jenny can put, the one deal is you got to sign up online. So Jenny, can you put the information for the day of service in the chat? And we would love to have you join us, you know, come and have some bagels and schmooze with some people, and then spend an hour or two volunteering. And I promise you, you are on the road to having a really good Sunday. So we would love to have you for our day of service.
Well, thank you very, very much for joining us. You're one of our family, and I think we've learned a lot about you, and very pleased with how you're representing us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joel. I appreciate that. And I guess I would just invite all of you. I know I've had the opportunity to, you know, meet Art and many of you on this call, but for those of you I haven't had a chance to meet in person, or even if I'm before, please come up as, you know, as we start to gather again in person. If you're on campus for the holidays or whatever it may be, just please come up and introduce yourself. I would love to get a chance to meet you all in person.
Thanks again.